Hello, everybody. Welcome to a very special episode of ASBN Live, a dialogue on the opportunity to advance land and ocean conservation and a sustainable economy. I'm Tulasi Sivalingam, the Senior Manager of Events and Programming here at the American Sustainable Business Network. And we're happy to be co-presenting this webinar today with BCCA, Businesses for Conservation and Climate Action. We are honored to be hosting the Department of the Interior this morning. It's now my pleasure to turn it over to David Levine, the co-founder and president of the American Sustainable Business Network. Take it away, David.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Thalisi. And as she mentioned, I am David Levine, president and co-founder of the American Sustainable Business Network. It's my pleasure to welcome you to a dialogue on the opportunities to advance land and ocean conservation and a sustainable economy. The American Sustainable Business Network is a movement builder in partnership with the business and investor community. As a multi-issue membership organization, we're advocating on behalf of businesses of all sectors, size, and geography. ASBN and its association members collectively represent over 250,000 enterprises. And together, we're leveraging that power, that voice, and resources of businesses and investors to influence public policy and capital markets to build a more sustainable economy that is stakeholder-driven, regenerative, just, and prosperous. We are so pleased to also have as a co-sponsor today Businesses for Conservation and Climate Action, BCCA. This is a groundbreaking initiative that ASBN has helped to develop with many leaders across the country. BCCA is a coalition of Indigenous and non-Indigenous community-based business leaders creating voice and power together in common cause. It's a bona fide business coalition advancing conservation, climate solutions, and just economic initiatives and policy. We're joined by several of the leaders of BCCA today, and we applaud their work and their vision. We're excited about today's discussion as we're going to bring attention to pathways for environmental, social, and economic solutions to the climate crisis. And we're going to talk about how business leaders can enhance their involvement and lend their voices to this movement. We're here today because we believe in a regenerative enterprise and economy. We believe that truly sustainable business should be a leading force for the policy discourse in our country, not taken for granted or treated as an afterthought, but it's a new way of thinking, and it's time to leave behind the old economic paradigms of short-term profit at all costs. We believe that Indigenous leadership in business and policy making is long overdue, and there are tremendous opportunities for investment in supporting their growth of their economies. We don't have to accept the false dichotomy that pits what is good for the economy against what is good for the planet. For an organization like ours, collaborating with tribes and supporting their exemplary leadership in co-stewardship initiatives represents the best of land and ocean conservation. We know that food sovereignty, regenerative practices, community-led conservation is good business, not just for those involved, but for all of us in our economy. We are excited by the bold initiatives of the Biden administration, including America the Beautiful, and other work across the federal family. And we appreciate the opportunities to continue to work in common cause on all of the above with our friends at the Department of Interior and the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And it is my special honor today to welcome and introduce Secretary Deb Haaland, the 54th Secretary of the U.S. Department of the Interior, proud member of Pueblo of Laguna, former small business owner, and a 35th generation New Mexican, to discuss today and to join our dialogue on advancing land and ocean conservation in a sustainable economy. Throughout her career in public service, Secretary Haaland has broken barriers and opened the doors of opportunity for future generations. In Congress, she focused on environmental justice, climate change, missing and murdered Indigenous women, and family-friendly policies. And now, as Secretary of the Interior, is making bold movement forward, working to preserve public lands for future generations. It is my humble and great honor to welcome you, Secretary Haaland.
Thank you so much, David. Thank you so much for that kind introduction. Thank you for everything you do. Really happy to be here. Thank you for talking about the President's America the Beautiful initiative, which we're so excited about here at the Department of the Interior, and you know, just mentioning the fact that community-led conservation works. We are happy to move that idea forward every single day in the work that we do. Thank you also to the American Sustainable Business Network for this invitation to join it, at least for a few minutes, to join today's dialogue. I'm so happy to be here with all of you. I appreciate the focus on land and ocean conservation as part of a sustainable economy. It makes perfect sense. We are charged with the highest trust responsibility here at the Department of protecting tribal interests, furthering our nation-to-nation relationship with Indian tribes. We have a distinct responsibility to ensure that all decisions that we make that relate to federal stewardship of lands, waters, and wildlife include consideration of how to safeguard the treaties, spiritual subsistence, cultural interests of tribes across the country. Tribal communities, as you know, as all of you know, are on the front lines of facing the effects of climate change. We've seen over and over again that tribes are having to move entire villages because of sea level rise. Those are all concerns that we care about deeply here at the Department of the Interior. Tribes also have a unique and millennia-long knowledge regarding conservation that they've handed down through the generations. Co-stewardship, it's not just an obligation for us, it's a tremendous opportunity. And by acknowledging and treating Indian tribes as partners in co-stewardship of our lands and waters will undoubtedly strengthen our federal land and resources management. So thank you so much again for having me. I'm also really thrilled that my colleague, Wizipan Garriott, is also joining all of you today. This administration, all of us here at Interior are committed to our future through conservation, and always so happy to have conversations and listen to folks and appreciate being here. David, thank you so much, and I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you, Secretary Haaland. It has been our extreme pleasure and honor to have you here with us, and we are committed to doing everything that we can to work with you in partnership, in collaboration to drive these initiatives forward. We have a moment in time, and it's a needed moment, and we so appreciate your incredible leadership. It is truly historic, what you and what you are accomplishing. So now, thank you, Secretary. And now it's my pleasure to turn it to Wizipan Garriott, who's the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary at the Bureau of Indian Affairs, the U.S. Department of the Interior. Wizipan is an enrolled member of the Rosebud Sioux tribe in South Dakota, is the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary, as I mentioned, and he was appointed in this role by Secretary Haaland in October 2021. He serves as the first assistant and principal advisor to Indian Affairs and in the development and the interpretation of policies affecting Indian Affairs, bureaus, offices, and programs. Prior to his appointment, he served as the Chief Executive Officer of the Rosebud Economic Development Corporation, REDCO, which is now Sagangu, an ecosystem of tribal organizations serving the Rosebud Indian Reservation. He helped lead and started businesses and community-based programs, including a native language immersion school and a 1,500 head buffalo herd. Wizzy, it's our pleasure to turn it to you now. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, David. How mitakipi iha chante washte na pe choose apelo. Wizipra emacha pelona si changu la kota hemacha na ashke gluipi tioshpai emataha. I greet each and every one of you with good heart. My name is Wizipan Garriott, and I'm a citizen of the Sicangu Lakota, also known as the Rosebud Sioux tribe, and I serve as Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for Indian Affairs. I'm joining today with just a tremendous amount of joy and gratitude in my heart. Every day I get to work with amazing people, and to serve under the leadership of Secretary Haaland, and to see my good friend David, and to watch all the great work that he and others are doing is just amazing, and to be a part of a group like that is just an honor and privilege. I'm really excited today to talk about Native co-stewardship and what some of those opportunities are. And I think we've heard this over and over again, but I want to reemphasize it, is that there's an incredible opportunity because of the nexus between tribes and tribal socio-economic development and economic needs, desires and plans, federal policy, and the private sector, and perhaps most important, conservation and the planet. And all of those interests can and should and must intersect, and it creates unprecedented opportunity. I think that a lot of these, what we're talking about, Indigenous people have known for a very, very long time. And there's different names for it. Some people talk about traditional ecological knowledge, and some talk about Indigenous knowledge. We at Interior and throughout the government are really moving towards utilizing Indigenous knowledge, IK, as a framework and as a basis for all of our work. And tribes have been doing this for a long time, for millennia, and we're able to grow and develop thriving communities, maintain healthy and vibrant relationships with the plant and animal worlds, to create and promote thriving ecological biodiversity and systems, and take care of their people and live in tremendous harmony, and great thriving economies and landscapes. And that's what the opportunity is with us, is to continue to do that work. We've talked a lot about, we've used the word bold today, and bold actions, bold words have to be supported by bold action. And this administration has made historic investments, not only into the country and into clean energy, into other areas, but also into tribal communities. We've seen with the bipartisan infrastructure law, and with most recently, we're seeing with the Infrastructure Reduction Act, historic investments into tribal communities. And a lot of those investments are around tribal conservation. And I think that we're going to continue to see some really amazing work happening there to tackle some of these big problems that we're facing. When we talk about investments, we're also talking about a policy investment. And tribal co-stewardship is a down payment on the future of our country, and really the future of our landscapes. Last November, at the 2021 White House Tribal Nation Summit, which is an annual summit where the president meets with all of the heads of the 574 federally recognized tribes in this country, a number of initiatives were laid out. And one of the ones that was really key and most important is our Tribal Homelands Initiative. And there were 4 policies that were laid out as a part of that initiative. The first was a memo from the White House directing all federal land management agencies to begin the process of incorporating Indigenous knowledge into their land management practices. And so this is a directive coming from the highest levels, essentially, telling us as federal land managers that we not only can, but that we must incorporate Indigenous knowledge into how we do our work, and that Indigenous knowledge has to have equal weight as Western science as we make our decisions. Second was a joint secretarial order that was issued by Secretary Haaland and Secretary Vilsack, directing our federal agencies at Interior and USDA to begin looking at signing co-stewardship agreements with Indian tribes. It also emphasized that it is our policy to strengthen and build tribal homelands. We're directed to seek that out and to also not just do one-off agreements here and there, but also to develop a framework so that work and that those initiatives outlast any one single individual. And I'm proud to say that work is happening. There have been several significant and meaningful co-stewardship agreements, in the last over the last year, and that the work is ongoing. I can spend a significant amount of my day working on in this area, and again, we have individual agreements, but also developing the framework. This is also supported by an interagency memorandum of agreement on treaty rights. And there's a interagency working group that is stood up and directed to begin the process of determining how to honor these sacred relationships that have been developed between the United States and Native nations. And that, one of the most significant components of the treaty rights MOU is that it's not just about access to treaty rights, but also the protection of those treaty rights themselves. And I think that that's a really big and significant advancement in that area, and that work is ongoing. And then finally, a third kind of big policy, or I'm sorry, a fourth big policy was an interagency memorandum of agreement directing a number of agencies to begin working together and with Native nations on the protection of sacred sites. Again, we could talk about this as perhaps treaty rights or in other areas, but we all know that tribes and indigenous communities have sacred sites. Each defines those differently according to their own, and that we need to start doing a more robust job in terms of how we're going to work with tribes to protect those sites. And so that work is ongoing. Those all taken together form the underpinnings of our Homelands Initiative. And again, it's bringing all of these various components together under a broad kind of initiative and policy. I think it's also important to understand, and again, drawing on our ITEC, we know that nothing happens in a vacuum, and that there is other work that is necessary that must take place in order for these initiatives to have a full life and to get the most out of them. And so we've also started we are in the process of developing new regulations for taking land into trust. And in our consultations and in the draft that we had put out, one of the purposes, and this is a change in the regulations and how federal Indian tribes can take land into trust, we have put forward that tribes can take land into trust not only for economic development purposes, but for cultural purposes as well as conservation purposes. And so that is another really, really important part of this work. I also want to emphasize that we have begun the process of really working with tribes further to begin providing better technical assistance, direction, and permitting around renewable energy projects. We know that tribes have tremendous opportunity around renewable energy, and those tribes that would like to unlock those resources for themselves, not only for tribal energy sovereignty, but also to provide that energy to others throughout the country. We need to be doing a better job in terms of how we're going to be doing that and working with tribes and being a value add as opposed to a hindrance to that process. I could get into a lot of the more kind of technical components of a lot of how this work interplays and works together. But I want to just end by talking about one agreement that was announced not too long ago. And many perhaps saw this, but the Rappahannock tribe in Virginia recently purchased 460 some acres of their ancestral territory that has significant cultural and historical value to them. That work happened over a long period of time, and it was done in partnership with the conservation community and with philanthropy. And essentially the way that worked was the tribe worked with philanthropy to be able to purchase this land. The tribe then worked with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, one of our sister agencies, to put a conservation easement on it. And we're anticipating that we will then soon begin working with the tribe to place that land into trust on their behalf. So they hold title to it. There's a conservation easement on it, and then the tribe wants, I think, is looking to think about putting that land into trust. We know, all of us here, I think, know and understand that given tribes' millennia and their unique historical and ties to the land, that once the tribe gets land, it's going to be protected, and they're going to protect it for as long as that tribe exists. And so acknowledging and honoring and recognizing tribal governments and Indian tribes' role in forwarding conservation is something that is needed. And when we look at the management and the directives that we've been given as federal land managers, and the challenges that we're facing as a nation and as a planet, we need to have tribes at the table. And that's a big part of our work. So I'm going to stop talking. I'll hand it back over to David, and we'll be on for the entire webinar to answer questions and contribute. I'm really excited to listening to the other presentations.
Thank you, Wizipan, and really appreciate that. And as he mentioned, we'll be doing a set of questions as time allows and the like. But as a part of the program, we also just wanted to highlight, some of the initiatives that we think are exemplary of this kind of work. And, it's our pleasure to have a number of ASBN, BCCA leaders whose Indigenous-led efforts exemplify, what is possible. And, first up is Dune Lankard, the president and founder of Native Conservancy, an amazing leader up in Alaska and exemplary across the country, from, the amazing fight that he put up around the Exxon Valdez spill to his incredible new work around Indigenous-led efforts around kelp. So it's my great pleasure to turn this over to Dune Lankard. Dune?
Yeah, thank you, David. And Good morning, Secretary Deb Haaland. I wanted you to know that all of us Indigenous peoples in Alaska were thrilled when you were appointed the Secretary of the Interior. And Wheezy, it's nice to say hello again. And I really appreciated your words. They give us hope up here in the north. My name is Dune Lankard. My EAC name is Jamutsiki, which means a little bird that screams really loud and won't shut up. But I heard that I'm on a 3-minute limit here. I'm an EAC Athabascan native from the Copper River Delta in Prince William Sound, and also the founder and chairman of the Native Conservancy. Alaska is changing faster than most places. The permafrost, the sea ice, and the glaciers are melting beyond belief, therefore quickly impacting our unique subsistence and wild salmon way of life here. With climate changing everything, we realized that after preserving 1 million acres of wild salmon habitat in the Exxon spill zone, that preserving the lands wasn't enough. We had to figure out how to grow things both on the land and in the sea. Our Native Conservancy decided to focus on how best to preserve our traditional foods longer. So we incorporated using wave energy freezing technology from Japan, which only has a 3% cell loss. So we're designing and wanting to build -21 Fahrenheit chest freezers for food security that can preserve food for 2 to 3 years rather than 9 to 12 months in traditional -10 chest freezers. We also decided to figure out how to source our own wild kelp seed. And we certified native divers to locate, harvest, deploy, and monitor Indigenous owned kelp farms. And we build portable seed nurseries to cultivate our own kelp seed. We have harvested, dried, pickled, smoked, fermented, cold pressed, and enjoyed kelp for thousands of generations here in Alaska and along our coast. There is currently no Mariculture Act for Alaska or America for that matter. Yet world kelp sales have risen from 9 billion to 15.6 billion since COVID broke out. That's an 11% increase in growth annually. Alaska has the potential to grow $1 billion kelp industry in this modern day land claims happening on our ocean. For Indigenous peoples, this ocean industry is about restoration of our oceans first, growing a traditional food source that keeps our people healthy and strong second, and creating a good paying blue-green regenerative economy that brings our native women and children back home to our villages. Indigenous people should not have to fight processors, corporations, pro-development districts, and outsiders for Justice 40 funds. We feel we need these $50 to $100 million community grants to lead this quickly emerging ocean industry that is happening on our ancestral waters. This is our land and our waters. It is time for ocean back. With critical Justice 40 funding, we could work together to figure out how to best incorporate renewable energies, as Wheezy mentioned, where we can offset high energy costs to build our boats and floater processors to harvest kelp and seafoods. We could process, value add, dehydrate, and pulverize wet kelp into a shelf-stable state, then transport powdered kelp and finished seafood products to market with our own native brand. We're also not interested in trading carbon credits either. We want to create a carbon inset program where we get paid to sequester carbon. Kelp is the fastest growing organism on the planet, and under the right conditions, it can grow 18 to 24 inches a day and can sequester more carbon if we leave it in the water longer. With kelp, we don't have to water it, feed it, fertilize it, or chase it around as I do as a commercial fisherman when I'm chasing salmon. We now need a fair, just, and equitable Mariculture Act that respects our inherent rights of self-determination, traditional ocean food sources, and one that honors our oceans and its critters. Based on thousands of years of traditional and customary use of kelp, this Mariculture Act should have a CDQ, a community development quota for mariculture component, in place for coastal tribal communities. In closing, this new yet very old ocean resource has the potential to build a regenerative economy based on conservation, restoration and mitigation, not further extraction of Alaska's natural resources, which would be another first. And the last thing I'd like to mention is that 30 by 30 just cannot happen without tribes leading. I've always felt that as the original stewards and guardians of the ocean and the land, that if we're going to conserve the land and create these sustainable economies for the future, that Indigenous peoples need to lead. Thank you.
Thank you, Dune, and thank you for all the work that you've been doing for decades and decades now.
Absolutely.
So next, I'd like to turn to Emily Boyd-Valandra, who's the president at Buffalo Nation's Grasslands Alliance. Emily, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you so much, David. Thank you, everyone. I'm honored to have been asked to be here and to share a little bit today. So mitaku yepi, greetings relatives. I'm also Sicanka Lakota here in South Central South Dakota. I've been part of the BCCA steering committee, but today I'm kind of here as my role as the president, I guess newly elected president of our Buffalo Nation's Grasslands Alliance. And so that's a new nonprofit organization that we just started last year. We're just now a year old. And so really what we've kind of started was we've identified that a major barrier to protecting native lands and the resources on which our people depend is a lack of sustainable financing. So where we originally started with sustainable financing as our goal, we've grown and kind of blossomed to include our people, our land, and everything that we all know is involved in that. So we're kind of focused in a region of the Northern Great Plains. So we have about 15, 16 Native nations in that region that we like to support. And so our vision and our plan is to kind of ensure that grasslands and native wildlife are restored or enhanced. We also want to ensure that tribal members thrive by sustainably stewarding and connecting with their natural resources. And that fish and game departments have the capacity to deliver conservation impacts at scale. So that was really kind of our goal, was to help our wildlife natural resources departments access and find that sustainable financing to carry out this big goal that we have. And so some of the goals that BINGAs have identified in the next 10 years is we'd like to see about 30% of tribal land in the Northern Great Plains is under some type of native-led conservation management. That could change, but that's kind of our initial goal. We'd also like to see that there's 10 paths of connectivity that are secured for Native nations in the Northern Great Plains that would support culturally and ecologically important wildlife species through native-led conservation management. Another one is that we'd like to see new sustainable and natural resource-based enterprises and jobs in Native communities that are created. And then I think a fourth big goal of ours is that tribal members' understandings and connections between people and nature are preserved and strengthened. And this includes our Indigenous lifeways that are promoted and opportunities for tribal members to engage with nature and making sure that we have access to all of that. And so it's kind of a balance between making sure that we have access to things for our own people first, and then decide which parts of those are going to be able to be shared from maybe an economical standpoint. Our main goals are to, of course, grassland conservation, but also with the people. We cannot talk about conservation in general without including our people. Our people have been part of this landscape for years and years and years. So I think it's something unique that BINGA is trying to do is kind of change the narrative, or not necessarily change it, but update it with language that's more appropriate to what reality is. And so when we're talking about things like conservation, it's hard to do that without talking about our people. And so that's something that was really big for us at BINGA. Sorry, another thing that I wanted to touch on today, I know there's so much good stuff being talked about, but I really want to thank Wizipan for talking about our Indigenous knowledge, especially at the level that he's at. We're really finding some great opportunities, some partnerships, some leadership at really higher levels that we haven't seen in a long time. But because of that, we really need to make sure that we're doing the work here on our nations, within our communities, to make sure that when we are being asked what our voices are and are being asked to be heard, we have a voice. And so that's some of the work that I also continue to do within my community and hope others are doing elsewhere. A couple more things I just want to touch on with Indigenous knowledge. I'm hoping that we can get to the point where we can also call it Indigenous science. I think science is science, and I think that when we break it apart, there are good and bad things, but I think it's important for especially our Indigenous people, but also the rest of the world, to acknowledge that our knowledge is science, and that it's you cannot have a complete approach of approaching conservation or science at all without the inclusion of Indigenous knowledge. So I really appreciate the work that Wizipan does and continues to do with all of his colleagues there. So I think that another thing that I just want to mention also, while I have a few time, is that planning within Indigenous communities hasn't always been the best because it hasn't been by us or for us, but I really feel like there's a need right now for better planning within our communities, and finally getting a point to say, this is our goal, this is what it's going to take to reach it, and kind of identifying the gaps that we have to reach those. Because what's happening is we're having, I don't know if it's post-COVID or because of all of the connections that we made from Zoom, but there's really a lot of partners that are wanting to help, but they don't necessarily know how. And so one thing that I always want to stress is that if we can take that back to our Indigenous communities to say, yes, now is the time, we do need a plan. We do need to have a plan that's not just a template from this tribe to somebody else, that acknowledges our uniqueness, and then of course finds our commonalities that we can build from. So again, I think I talked and talked. I'm not sure where I'm at for time. I apologize if I talk too fast. This is something that's really passionate and close to my heart. And so again, I appreciate the opportunity to be with you today, and hope we can continue more of this conversation and good efforts in the future. So thank you, David, and everyone.
Well, thank you, Emily. And I think, what we're using this conversation today, talking fast and all, is to try and squeeze in, at least to offer up, a foundation for the dialogue and for the work to follow up. So, again, Emily with the Buffalo Nations Grasslands Alliance and a part of BCCA, and we're committed to finding the partnerships with everyone on the call, and obviously the many others out there that want to help move this work forward. So next up, we're going to have a bit of a look into the work of the Aleut community of St. Paul Island, around the co-managed marine sanctuary.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Noah Oppenheim. I have the pleasure and privilege of working on behalf of the Aleut community of St. Paul Island's tribal government. As a consultant, I'm also the National Policy Coordinator for Businesses for Conservation and Climate Action. I live and work on the unceded ancestral territory of the Wabanaki people in southern Maine. And I'm speaking to you today, as David mentioned, about the extraordinary leadership that the tribal government in St. Paul Island, in the Pribilof Islands in the middle of the Bering Sea, is doing to enhance the stewardship of the ocean areas around their ancestral homelands, St. Paul Island. The nomination of the first co-management based sanctuary with government to government co-management or co-stewardship with a federally recognized tribal government called Alagum Kano was nominated late last year by the tribal government. Alagum Kano would be an area designated under the National Marine Sanctuary Act in the federal, state, and coastal waters, potentially around St. Paul Island and the Pribilofs. The story of this nomination is incomplete without a narrative arc of the people of St. Paul. In the 1700s, Russian fur sealers enslaved the people of the Aleutian Islands, brought them to the Pribilof Islands, and forced them to participate in the northern fur seal harvest. That took place over the course of several decades until the United States purchased Alaska in 1867, where the US government took over this fur sealing enterprise and continued to hold the people of the Pribilof Islands in indentured servitude, effectively forcing them to continue this harvest practice, forcibly transporting them off their homelands to Southeast Alaska during World War II, and then continuing this exploitative practice where they were wards of the state deep into the 20th century. When the Fur Seal Act in the 1960s was passed, the promise was made to transition the people of the Pribilofs from a fur seal dependent economy to a fishing dependent economy. And the fisheries of the Bering Sea and around the Pribilof Islands are now worth hundreds of millions to billions of dollars per year. The people of the Pribilofs have participated in these fisheries, and they are a fishing people. However, with significant declines in crab and fish resources around the Pribilofs, the people of St. Paul are seeking to enhance their economy by expanding into a research and tourism focused economy to substantiate the risk posed by climate change to the resource-based economy there. They've nominated Alagoon Canoe under the principles of federally recognized tribal co-management, conservation, and enterprise that will support the tribe's future endeavors in all three of those areas long into the future. The process for designating the sanctuary is long, and there's a long road ahead for the tribe and for those of us working on it, but it's an absolute privilege to include this nomination as a cornerstone of BCCA's work on conservation and on supporting our Indigenous tribal members as they seek to enhance their self-determination long into the future. So thank you very much for the opportunity to speak, and we look forward to continuing this conversation. Thank you.
And yes, thank you, Noah, and our best to Marissa Mercurieff, who was due to speak today, but has been working long and hard on this and has lost her voice for the moment. So Noah, thanks for pitching in. All right, Wizipan, if you can come back on screen here and the like. I know we've got some time here for a number of questions. So I've got some in here already. And Abby Fain from the Intertribal Agricultural Council, could we get you up first? All right, let's unmute. There we go.
Hi, thank you so much for letting me join today. As David mentioned, I'm with the Intertribal Agriculture Council. I'm their Director of Policy and Government Relations, and we do quite a bit of work with tribal ranchers and producers. We are a native nonprofit that has technical assistance all over Indian country to respond to issues that arise on the ground. And we're really excited and appreciative that that Secretary Haaland and you have joined us in this conversation, and that you're elevating conservation as a top priority. We know that there are some promising conservation programs and plans available to tribes and tribal producers, but accessing them hasn't necessarily gone smoothly. So the question I have is, does the department have plans to address either resource training issues or cost barriers that have stalled tribal access to some of the conservation opportunities like agricultural resource management plans? And if so, what approach might the department take or facilitate to remove some of these hurdles?
Thanks, Abby. That's a great question. I think one of the first things is, one is in terms of thinking about access, is eligibility, right? And I've seen some leases, that like they're written in such a way that they're ineligible for either tribes as landowners or for producers to access USDA conservation programs. And that's one of the things that we were thinking of, that we would really like to consider when we're thinking about new ag regulations, is how can we develop new regulations, amended regulations that will promote a lot of the goals that we've been talking about today. Conservation, I think one of the speakers talked about, it's important. We can't forget people as well, right? It's people, planet, and business, right? Like and we have to think about it from an entire, kind of not in addition to the ecological ecosystem, but an ecosystem of economy. And so I really am excited to start that work. I think there's gonna be some really great opportunities to engage there, so that we can use the power of our regulations to promote sustainability, regenerative ag, and I want to make this very, very clear, that indigenous ag came and comes before regenerative ag. That all of the regenerative ag principles that everyone's talking about, and it's kind of the new rage, that comes from indigenous ag, and indigenous ag is indigenous knowledge. And so that really needs to be the foundation. So how can we promote, again, using that term, regenerative ag, indigenous ag, that will benefit people and the planet? That's something that's really important. And I'm really glad that you bring up the agricultural resource management plan component as well, because I think we've heard over and over again that we need to do more work there. And I would really, really welcome a further conversation on that and how we can think about doing a better job there.
Great. Thank you both. And now, Sierra Flanagan, we have a question from you from the Livable Planet Working Group at ASBN. Sierra?
Hello, everyone. My name is Sierra Flanagan. I'm here on behalf of the Livable Planet Working Group. We're a cross-section of systems change makers and advocates working across biodiversity, climate, water, food, deep ecology, all to ensure a healthy and habitable biosphere for generations to come. And we're so excited about all the work that ASBN and BCCA are doing, who are part of our working group, and about the administration's leadership and everything you're talking about, Wizzy. So I'd like to ask, what's the opportunity for business leaders and investors to lend our expertise and dollars to really support the co-stewardship, ocean and land protection, and indigenous science initiatives we're hearing about here?
Great question. Something we do a lot of time thinking about, and exciting work happening. I want to talk about kind of two things. One is the framework and the process, right? I mentioned in the opening remarks that one of the best ways, most effective ways to forward conservation is to work directly with a tribe, right? Because if you're from a philanthropy standpoint, helping the tribe acquire land or consolidate land that they can then use to put into conservation. And conservation does also, want to make sure that doesn't exclude economic opportunity, right? We talked about indigenous ag, we just heard from Dune and the amazing work that he's doing. There's some amazing work happening around buffalo. The tribes in the Northwest are the world leaders in fish. So conservation and economic development go hand in hand. So philanthropy can invest directly into tribes and finding those projects. From a business standpoint, I think that helping and matching the right kind of funding to the right kind of project is incredibly important. And I think that we have some more work to do around that and sustainable investing, social impact investing. And then the second piece I want to talk a little bit about is our work. We are working to stand up an office of strategic public-private partnerships, where we here in Indian Affairs can work with tribes that are seeking to develop conservation projects, and then also work with philanthropy and others to help matchmake and to bring those two groups together. I don't think that has always happened, but I think that we're on the verge. The work is happening more than it has, and I think that we're going to see a lot more of it happening over the next couple of years. So, we would always be happy to have a conversation with any group out there and work together to figure out how we can bring those two worlds together.
Thank you so much.
Great. Next up, Terius Harris.
Hello, Assistant Secretary Wizipan. Thank you so much for joining us today and being here for this webinar. I wanted to thank you and Secretary Haaland. I believe that conversations like these that turn into action really are what create change in our Indigenous community. So I appreciate you being here today. My name is Terius Harris. I'm the Indigenous Business Outreach Coordinator for the Business for Conservation and Climate Action, or BCCA, as David so kindly and very thoroughly explained at the beginning of the call. Understanding that since time immemorial, tribes have developed land and water stewardship practices across many diverse ecosystems on this continent. What is your advice on how any tribal members and communities seeking to start or grow their own business can continue to uphold these practices in partnership with DOI and BIA, and how can they learn how can they learn more beyond this webinar? And also, how can groups like BCCA and ASBN support these efforts?
That's an amazing question, and it's kind of geared towards both individuals as entrepreneurs, and Indigenous entrepreneurs. One resource, we have two resources that I think are really helpful and important. One, within the Office of the Assistant Secretary for Indian Affairs, we have the Office of Indian Economic Development, which provides to tribes various grant resources, including planning resources, and the tribes can use for feasibility studies and work like that. And then also administers the Indian Loan Guarantee Program, which over the last, I think between 2017 and 21 has put over $500 million out to Indian businesses across the country. So I think that's one kind of technical resource that we can offer. Also, within the BIA Office of Trust Services, we have a lot of different programs where we provide technical assistance and services directly to tribes and tribal businesses, particularly around energy and energy development. And I'd mentioned earlier that we need to start doing a better job around promoting and working with around renewable energy. So that's another amazing resource. Within that, Office of Trust Services, we also have our Ag department here at Department of Interior, and I think that's a great and growing resource there as well. But in general, I don't, kind of coming from this world, and I think it's something that a lot of Native people have intuitively. We grew up with it, or we're exposed to it, but we don't necessarily attach these kind of fancy concept words to it, right? And so I think that part of it is just acknowledging that we do have this knowledge, it's inherent, and we may not realize it, but it's about kind of unlocking that inner potential.
That's great. I have a few, we're closing on time, but we've got a few more questions that have come in, and maybe I'll just try and tackle some of them. I got one from Rudy Arredondo from the National Latino Farmers and Ranchers, who's asking what initiatives are in place to respond to wildfires, infrastructure development on native lands, and especially access to rural broadband.
There's a lot.
Sorry, you got three things, each of which could, well, thank you, Rudy.
Okay, so fire, in the bipartisan infrastructure law, we saw a historic investment, in the magnitude of hundreds of millions of dollars that were put towards wildfire, and that also includes tribes and is a part of the kind of interagency wildfire working group that Department of Interior and its various sub-agencies has with USDA. So there's more resources out and being put out there than ever before. Going back to traditional ecological knowledge, we got to incorporate that into our land management and kind of emergency response systems, especially around fire. Tribes have been doing that for a long time. What was the other? There was two other was fire and
Broadband
broadband
and infrastructure development on native land.
infrastructure. Again, in the bipartisan infrastructure law, another historic investment, 3 billion plus has been allocated for tribal broadband and infrastructure. And that is at the Department of Commerce is managing that. And if you've been following the news, there's been some pretty big, grant announcements to tribes. And those announcements have been in the, I think one was like 45 million, another like 75 million, like big ones. From our part, right? So Commerce is putting the money out, giving the money to the tribes. But from our part, we're really involved in the permitting and rights of way process. And so we put out a national policy memo directing our field offices to work directly with other agencies and with tribes to prioritize permitting and rights of way processes for any broadband project in Indian country and for all projects that are funded by the bipartisan infrastructure law. Because the money's there, but it's got to get spent, and we want to reduce bureaucracy as much as possible. Doing it in a responsible way, though, we're not going to forego our duties to make sure that we're adhering and to all of our environmental regulations. But we're going to be doing this to get the money out as quickly as possible. And then infrastructure, again, more historic investments in infrastructure than we've ever seen before. I think we're going to see some really great work happening around electric vehicles and EVs in Indian country, as well as just, again, historic investments into our road infrastructure as well.
Well, there's a lot more questions coming in, and what I would also advise is if folks will gather these, and we're happy to pass them along to Wizipan and the like, so folks want to add their questions into the chat along with their email, then we'll be able to gather those later. But I guess, before we close out, just even if you could touch on it in a moment, listen, I think there's tremendous concern, whether it is, how to protect tribal lands and enforce treaty rights. There's one question about from state seizure under eminent domain. And I think there's, grave concerns also about, some of the fossil fuel infrastructure, that, many are, well, that we think are possible, after the, the Inflation Reduction Act and the like. And so, particularly those running through indigenous lands, let alone other lands and the like. So, how do these treaties hold up? How do these agreements and these protections, with the incredible work that you do? And if you could just take it's terrible, we only have a few minutes left, but if you could take a minute to at least lead us in the right direction, and then we'll work to close out.
Two things. One, I talked about our new land into trust regulations. So critical, so important. The state can't take exercise eminent domain on federal land, and so if tribes are able to put that land into trust, that land is a whole set of protections that would not exist otherwise. And I also want to put a plug in for our fiscal year 23 budget request that we put out, where we actually requested money for land acquisition to work with tribes on acquiring land, which they could then put into trust. So that's something that is an incredibly useful tool. And then, this broad question around working with tribes and whatnot. Consultation is really the backbone. And Executive Order 13175 is a directive to our federal agencies around consultation, that we need to begin working and having a meaningful dialogue with tribes as soon as possible when we're requiring and considering any kind of project. Because if we don't do it, and if we do it as an afterthought, that does not work. It won't work. It has to be early and consistent meaningful with the decision makers at the table. And so to start those dialogues and to hear everyone, we have to work with consultation. And I think that, you know, people can be looking forward to a new consultation policy. We issued a draft one and have consulted on our consultation policy. And tribes have made some really great and important and insightful recommendations as that's being developed.
Well, thank you for that. Tough questions but phenomenal work by all of you, and thank you, Wizipan, for your incredible leadership at the Department of Interior Bureau of Indian Affairs. We're so pleased to have had the Secretary on along with you today, and all this to say that the work is ongoing. And we just thank everyone for joining us today, and we hope that you'll stay in touch with Businesses for Conservation and Climate Action and the American Sustainable Business Network. The contact information will end up, on the screen in a moment, but it's also in the chat. But we hope that you can join up and step up our efforts to work collaboratively and collectively. That's the opportunity that we have to protect our land and oceans and to build a more just, inclusive, and sustainable economy. So thank you, everyone, for joining us today, and let's get to work.
Thank you, everyone.